At my daughter's wedding planning, she said, "My stepdad is walking me down the aisle. You can just watch from the audience." I said, "I'll bring popcorn." 3 weeks later, the wedding venue called asking about the missing $20,000 deposit. Her stepdad's check had bounced. I, 52M, learned a long time ago that sometimes the best response to disrespect is silence. But when my daughter looked me dead in the eye during her wedding planning meeting and told me her stepdad would be walking her down the aisle while I could watch from the audience, something inside me finally snapped into place. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. I told her I'd bring popcorn. She didn't laugh. Her mother, my ex-wife, shot me a look that could have melted steel. Her stepdad, the man who'd slept with my wife while we were still married and now apparently deserved the honor of giving away my daughter, just smirked. They thought I was being childish. Maybe I was. But I was also done pretending that their betrayal hadn't fundamentally changed who I was. The divorce happened 8 years ago. My daughter was 14 then, and I thought we'd weather it together. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. I was wrong about my marriage. Wrong about my wife's late nights at the office. Wrong about thinking my daughter would see through the lies her mother fed her. The affair had been going on for 2 years before I found out, and by the time the truth came out, my ex had already poisoned the well. I was the absent father, she said. The workaholic who cared more about his career than his family. Never mind that I was working those hours to pay for the house she wanted, the lifestyle she demanded, the private school tuition for our daughter. When the dust settled, I got every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. My daughter started canceling those Wednesdays within 6 months. By the time she turned 16, the weekend visits had become monthly, then sporadic, then basically nothing. She had a new family now. A stepdad who took her shopping and didn't lecture her about responsibility. A mother who let her do whatever she wanted. I became the bad guy by default, the ghost of family past who showed up occasionally to remind everyone of uncomfortable truths. I tried, though. God knows I tried. I showed up to every birthday party I was invited to, which wasn't many. I sent money for every school trip, every cheerleading uniform, every spring break vacation. I paid my child support on time, every single month, and then some. I called and texted, even when the responses became one-word answers or nothing at all. I told myself she was just being a teenager, that she'd come around eventually, that our relationship would heal with time. But time just made things worse. The stepdad was always there, always playing the hero. He coached her soccer team for a year. He taught her to drive. He took her to college visits while I learned about her acceptances through Facebook posts. When she graduated high school, I sat in the back row because there were only so many tickets, and of course her mother's family needed them more. The stepdad got to stand on stage during some special recognition ceremony. I watched from a distance, clapping along with strangers. I swallowed it all. Every slight, every exclusion, every moment of being treated like an ATM instead of a father. I told myself that maintaining some relationship was better than none at all. That if I just stayed patient, stayed present in whatever limited capacity she allowed, things might eventually change. The wedding planning meeting happened 3 months ago. My daughter called me herself, which was rare enough to make me hopeful. She said she wanted me there when they discussed the ceremony details. I took the afternoon off work and drove to her mother's house, the same house I'd paid off before the divorce, where the stepdad now lived like a king. They were all sitting around the dining room table when I arrived. My daughter, her fiancée, my ex-wife, and him. The stepdad. He'd aged well, I had to admit. Money and lack of conscience apparently do wonders for your complexion. My ex barely looked at me when I came in. We'd perfected the art of cold civility over the years. My daughter seemed nervous, which should have been my first warning. She kept glancing at her mother, like she was looking for permission to speak. Finally, she just came out with it. She'd been thinking about the ceremony, about who would walk her down the aisle, and she'd decided that her stepdad should do it. He'd been there for her, she said, for all the important moments. He felt more like a real father to her now. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my face neutral. I asked if there was any particular reason she was telling me this, since it seemed like the decision was already made. She got defensive then, saying she wanted me to know because I was still her father and she wanted me at the wedding. Just not in that role. I could sit with the other guests and watch. It would still be special. That's when I said it. The popcorn line. I told her that sounded great, and I'd make sure to bring popcorn for the show. Maybe some junior mints too. Really make an afternoon of it. My ex exploded. She started yelling about how I was being petty and childish, how this was my daughter's special day, and I was making it about myself. The stepdad jumped in, saying I'd always been bitter about the divorce and couldn't stand seeing them happy. My daughter just sat there, tears forming in her eyes, and I realized that this had all been orchestrated. They'd wanted me there specifically so they could deliver this news together, make me the villain when I inevitably reacted badly. But I didn't give them that satisfaction. I stood up calmly, wished my daughter well with her wedding planning, and left. On the drive home, my hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over. I sat in a parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to breathe, trying to process what had just happened. Not the decision itself, which hurt but wasn't entirely surprising. It was the cruelty of it, the calculated humiliation. They could have told me privately. My daughter could have called me, explained her feelings, given me a chance to understand. Instead, they'd set up a performance with an audience. That night, I made a decision. I was done being the punching bag, done paying for the privilege of being disrespected, done funding a life that had no room for me in it. I called my lawyer the next morning. We'd worked together on the divorce, and he'd remained a friend over the years. I explained the situation and asked him a simple question. What were my legal obligations regarding the wedding? He was quiet for a moment, then told me the truth I already knew. Legally, I owed nothing. My daughter was 23, an adult. Child support had ended when she turned 18. Anything I contributed to her wedding would be purely voluntary, a gift, not an obligation. Then he asked me what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking about respecting my daughter's wishes. She wanted the stepdad to be her real father. He could do what real fathers do. He could pay for the wedding. My lawyer was quiet again, then asked if I was sure. I'd been planning for this wedding for years, he said. I'd mentioned it before, how I'd been setting money aside, how I wanted to give my daughter something beautiful even if our relationship was strained. He knew I had almost $50,000 saved specifically for this purpose. Walking away from that plan would be a serious statement. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything. The thing was, everyone had just assumed I'd pay. My ex had probably told the vendors that I'd be covering certain costs. The wedding was expensive, as these things are. Venue, catering, flowers, photographer, band, open bar. My daughter had expensive taste, inherited from her mother. The total budget was pushing 6 figures. The stepdad had apparently volunteered to cover the venue deposit, a $20,000 chunk that needed to be paid up front to secure the booking. My ex was handling the catering. Various relatives were chipping in for other elements. And I was supposed to cover the rest, probably $40,000 or $50,000 when all was said and done. Except nobody had actually asked me. They'd just assumed. The same way they'd assumed I'd be fine sitting in the audience while another man walked my daughter down the aisle. The same way they'd always assumed I'd swallow whatever disrespect they served and come back for more. I didn't announce my decision. I just stopped responding to messages about the wedding. My daughter texted me a few times asking about floral arrangements and whether I preferred chicken or fish for the reception dinner. I left them on read. My ex called once, her voice dripping with false sweetness, asking if I'd had a chance to review the vendor contracts she'd sent over. I told her I'd been busy and hung up. 3 weeks passed. I went to work, hit the gym, had dinner with friends, lived my life. The wedding was still 2 months away, so I wasn't worried about any last-minute scrambling. If anyone wanted to have a real conversation with me about expectations and contributions, they knew where to find me. But nobody called to apologize. Nobody reconsidered the aisle decision. Silence suited me fine. Then I got the call from the venue coordinator. She sounded stressed, apologetic, confused. She was calling about the deposit for my daughter's wedding. The check they'd received had bounced. Not just failed to clear, but bounced due to insufficient funds. She'd tried calling the number associated with the check, my ex-wife's number apparently, but nobody had called her back. The venue had a policy about bounced checks, and they needed the deposit resolved within 48 hours, or they'd have to release the date to another couple who was interested. I let that sink in for a moment. The stepdad's check had bounced. $20,000, just gone. And now they were calling me, probably because my number was on file from some earlier inquiry, or because someone had listed me as the father of the bride on the original paperwork. I told the coordinator I appreciated her calling, but there seemed to be some confusion. I wasn't involved in the financial arrangements for this wedding. She should continue reaching out to whoever had signed the contracts. She sounded panicked then, explaining that they'd been trying for 3 days and nobody was responding. Did I understand that the venue would be lost if this wasn't resolved immediately? It was a very popular location, and they had a waiting list. I understood perfectly, I told her. I wished her luck sorting it out and ended the call. My phone started ringing 30 minutes later. My ex, for calls in a row. I let them all go to voicemail. Then my daughter called, and I have to admit, I hesitated before sending that one to voicemail too. But I did. Then texts started flooding in. From my ex, from my daughter, even one from the stepdad himself. All of them increasingly frantic. The messages from my ex were predictably aggressive. I needed to call her immediately. There was an emergency with the wedding. How dare I ignore her calls when my daughter needed me? I was being selfish and vindictive. She knew I had the money. This was my responsibility. My daughter's messages were more manipulative. Dad, please call me. I don't know what's happening, but Mom says the venue might cancel. You wouldn't let that happen, would you? This is my wedding. I know you're hurt, but please don't take it out on me like this. The stepdad's single message was brief. We need to talk. Man to man. Call me. I deleted them all and poured myself a drink. By the next morning, I had 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. I blocked my ex's number, but my daughters kept coming through. She'd moved from manipulation to pleading. She was sorry if I felt disrespected. Maybe they could talk about the aisle thing again. Please just call her. The venue was going to cancel. Where was I? Why wasn't I helping? I finally responded with a single text. I told her I was respecting her wishes. She'd made it clear that her stepdad was her real father now, the one who'd been there for all the important moments. So he could handle this important moment too. I wished her all the best with the wedding planning. She called immediately. I let it ring. The voicemail she left was a mix of crying and anger. I was being cruel, she said. This wasn't about the aisle thing. This was about her entire wedding. Did I want her to have no wedding at all? Was I really that petty? Fine, I could walk her down the aisle. Was that what I wanted? Would I help now? I saved the voicemail but didn't respond. By the end of that day, they'd lost the venue. The coordinator left me one final message, very professional, just informing me that the booking had been canceled due to non-payment and the date had been released. She hoped everything worked out for our family. My phone went quiet for about 12 hours after that. I imagined the chaos happening in my ex's house, the blame being thrown around, the desperate calls to other venues, only to discover that everything decent was booked months in advance. The reality settling in that the stepdad, for all his swagger and promises, didn't actually have $20,000 to drop on a venue deposit. I did some digging through a mutual friend and learned the truth. The stepdad's business had been struggling for the past year. He'd been living on credit, maintaining the appearance of success while drowning in debt. The check hadn't bounced by accident. The money simply didn't exist. He'd probably written it hoping to figure something out before it cleared, or maybe assuming someone else would cover it eventually. That someone being me. My ex called from a different number, one I didn't recognize until I answered. Her voice was different this time. Not angry, but tired. Defeated. She asked if I was really going to let my daughter's wedding fall apart over pride. I asked if she remembered my daughter telling me I could watch from the audience. I asked if she remembered sitting there while her husband smirked at my humiliation. I asked if anyone had planned to tell me I was expected to fund a wedding where I was essentially a spectator. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said I'd always been welcome, that I was being oversensitive, that the aisle thing was just my daughter honoring the man who'd raised her these past 8 years. I reminded her who'd actually raised our daughter for the first 14 years, who'd paid for everything even after the divorce, who'd been pushed aside and disrespected while still showing up, still contributing, still trying. She started to say something, but I cut her off. I told her I was done. If she wanted to explain to our daughter why her wedding was falling apart, she could tell her the truth. Her stepdad didn't have the money he'd promised, and her real father was no longer willing to be a bank account with no voting rights. I hung up and blocked that number too. Update 1. The fallout was spectacular. My daughter posted a long, vague message on Facebook about how some people show their true colors in times of need. She didn't name me, but the implications were clear enough. Her friends flooded the comments with support, calling whoever had disappointed her toxic and selfish. My ex's family joined in, making pointed comments about deadbeat dads and broken promises. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself, didn't explain. Let them think what they wanted. What they didn't know was that several of my daughter's cousins, kids I'd been close with over the years, had reached out to me privately. They'd heard the full story from various sources and wanted me to know they understood. One of them, my brother's daughter, told me she'd always thought it was messed up how they treated me. She'd watched me get excluded from family events, seen the way my ex and the stepdad acted like I didn't exist. She respected me for finally drawing a line. That helped more than I expected. My daughter eventually called from her fiancé's phone. I answered because I didn't recognize the number. She sounded exhausted, completely wrung out. She said they'd found a new venue, much smaller and cheaper. Her fiancé's parents were helping cover the costs. The wedding was scaled back significantly, basically a backyard event now instead of the elaborate affair she'd planned. She hoped I was happy. I asked if she was happy with how things had turned out. She got quiet. Then she asked what I meant. I told her I meant exactly what I said. Was she happy? With the choices she'd made, with the people she'd surrounded herself with the man who'd promised to take care of her wedding venue and then bounced a $20,000 check? She started crying then. Real, ugly sobbing. She said she didn't know anymore. That everything was a mess. That her stepdad kept promising he'd fix things, but nothing was getting fixed. That her mom was furious with everyone. That her fiancé was stressed and they'd been fighting. That she just wanted a nice wedding and didn't understand why everything had to be so complicated. I let her cry for a bit. Then I asked her if she remembered what she'd said to me at that planning meeting. About me watching from the audience. She went quiet except for sniffling. I asked if she understood how that felt, being told I wasn't good enough to be her father in any meaningful way, but still being expected to pay for everything like I was. She said she was sorry. That her mom and stepdad had coached her on what to say. That they'd told her the aisle thing was traditional and right, and I'd understand. That she'd felt pressured and caught in the middle. I asked her why she'd never called me after. Why she'd gone along with assuming I'd still pay for everything after disrespecting me like that. Why it took losing a venue for her to suddenly remember I existed. She didn't have an answer for that. I told her I loved her. That I'd always love her. But I was done being treated like a wallet with no feelings. If she wanted a relationship with me, a real one, it would have to be built on respect. Both ways. Not me begging for scraps while funding a life I wasn't welcome in. She asked if that meant I wouldn't help with the wedding at all. I told her that ship had sailed. She'd made her choices, and now she'd live with the consequences. Maybe that sounded harsh, but sometimes lessons hurt. She hung up without saying goodbye. Update 2. The wedding happened last month. I didn't attend. I wasn't technically uninvited, but I wasn't invited either. The silence made the decision for me. I spent that day fishing with my brother. We didn't talk much about the wedding, just enjoyed the weather and the quiet. He told me he was proud of how I'd handled things. Said it took guts to walk away from something you'd planned for years. I told him it hadn't felt like walking away. More like finally putting down a weight I'd been carrying too long. My daughter sent me a few photos afterwards. She looked beautiful. Happy. The stepdad had walked her down the aisle after all, in the small backyard ceremony. I looked at the pictures for a long time, trying to feel something other than tired. Here's what nobody tells you about standing your ground. It doesn't feel victorious. It just feels necessary. Like finally setting a broken bone that's been healing wrong. My ex's sister reached out a week after the wedding. She'd always been decent to me, even after the divorce. She said my daughter had been asking about me during the reception, wondering if I'd show up as a surprise. Getting increasingly quiet as the night went on, and I didn't. I asked if my daughter had considered calling me herself. Her aunt said she had, but she was embarrassed. Ashamed. Didn't know what to say. I told her aunt that was something my daughter would have to work through herself. Last week, I got a letter in the mail. Actual handwritten letter, not a text or email. From my daughter. She said she'd been thinking a lot about everything that happened. About the choices she'd made. About how she'd let other people's opinions shape her relationship with me. She said she was sorry, but she understood if sorry wasn't enough. She wanted to try to rebuild things, if I was willing. Slowly, on my terms. No expectations. She included a wedding photo. One I hadn't seen before. It was taken during the reception, a candid shot of her sitting alone at the head table, staring off at nothing. She looked sad. Lost. She'd written on the back. This is when I was thinking about you. I've read that letter maybe 20 times now. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to. Part of me is still angry. Part of me is just tired of the whole thing. But I've kept the letter on my desk, where I see it every morning. Maybe that's a start. Maybe she's finally learning what I tried to teach her all along. Actions have consequences. Respect isn't automatic. And sometimes the people who love you most are the ones willing to let you fall so you can learn to stand on your own. The money I'd saved for her wedding is still sitting in that account. I haven't touched it. Haven't decided what to do with it yet. Maybe I'll use it for a long vacation. Maybe I'll save it for grandkids someday. If we ever get to a place where I'm invited into that part of her life. Maybe I'll donate it to something meaningful. What I won't do is regret my decision. I spent 8 years being a doormat, hoping patience would heal wounds that required surgery. Sometimes love means teaching people that you have value, even if the lesson hurts. I'll bring popcorn, I'd said. Turns out I didn't need to. The show found its own way of falling apart. And me? I'm learning to be okay with that. If you like this story, please like this video and subscribe us for more such real-life-based stories. Thanks in advance.